welcome to Miss Rose's Story Time. We're towards the end of our book, Carry On Mr. Bowditch, and I thought it would be apropos to sit by our pond. I'm really thankful that God has allowed us to live where we live during this quarantine. And we are on, let's see here, we are on chapter 23, I believe. Or are we on chapter 22? Let me see here. Let's see, we read yesterday, not yesterday, but Saturday. Chapter 121, I remember that one. And we read chapter 22. So, yep, we're on chapter 23. Okay, so it's on page 228. Captain Bowditch commanding. That's Angus. Alright. Come along with me, Nate, Dr. Holyoke suggested. You might as well help set a leg. 6 months from now, you might be bossing the job. When they turned in at Lem's gate, they could hear him raging. When Lem saw them, he broke out afresh. He'd been mending the singled roof of their little house when the ladder had slipped sideways. He tangled with it and he'd fallen. Me, he stormed, me fall off a house. Me, that's a hung by my eyebrows, reefing sail in a storm. Fix me up good, Doc, so I can be ready when the Putnam sails. Not a chance of it, Lem. This is a compound fracture. Now listen, Doc. Shut up, man. You'd be a nuisance on shipboard. Oh, Lem was silent. Then listen, Captain Bowditch. There's a lot I'd better tell you. When you hit the coral reefs of Samarta, Lem never stopped talking while the leg was set. Nate was glad Polly wasn't there to hear everything he said of Samarta. November 21st, the Putnam sailed, bound for Samarta and the Pepper Islands, God willing. Captain Bowditch commanding. Captain Bowditch commanding. Nate looked about his ship and whispered those words to himself. He shook his head. Departure from Cape Ann. In his cabin, he marked his chart and started the log of the Putnam. Billy Partle, his cabin boy, entered. Mr. Denny's compliments, sir. The watches are set. Nate went on deck. Lupe's smile flashed and was reefed. Mr. Sanchez, now second mate of the Putnam. A good man, a good crew, Nate thought. Old Chad Henson at the wheel. Chad's grandson, young Corey, looked edgy. Probably hadn't found his sea legs yet. Good stuff in the boy. Nate spoke to them quietly. He had good men in charge. He told them, Mr. Denny, Mr. Sanchez, they were to be obeyed at all times. He saw a flicker of bewilderment in the eyes of the crew. I suppose I should have roared, he told himself, but I can't think of anything to roar about. He told Mr. Denny and Mr. Sanchez he'd seen them below at one bell. When he talked to his mates, he told them again they were in charge. Unless you need me, of course, but I don't expect you will. They said, aye, aye, sir. They went above. Then, for the first time, the awful aloneness hit him. He was responsible. Finally and completely. All the long, lonely way to the Cape, all the treacherous squally. Weeks in the Indian Ocean, he was responsible. No matter what came up, night or day, if it baffled his men, he must decide. For the first time, he began to understand Captain Prince. The set of his jaw and the bite of his words when a voyage began, the internal alertness that never relaxed. He knew now why Prince always seemed to shed about 10 years when they made their landfall. He thought of his father, his sloop around on Aquila Reef. He imagined how it must have been to watch helpless while his future was beaten to pieces. He remembered how Granny had said, It took the tuck out of him. He remembered the threat of battle of Cadiz when he had pulled off his shoes and had gone to the powder room. He had forgotten where he was, had worked problems on a powder keg. He couldn't forget now. If battle threatened, he couldn't let others make the decisions. If they were challenged now, he must decide if he'd surrender his ship, if the men would die defending it. If he lost a man, he must answer the faces on the wharf when he returned, Lupe's young bride, Denny's wife, and the two boys. Nate shook his head and went up topside. He'd have to stop that way of thinking. Not 12 hours from home. He'd be gone 12 months, maybe longer. He was sailing to the uncharted coast in an untried ship. No man knew yet how the Putman would sail. In the days that followed, the Putman proved herself with flying colors. She passed Eliza that had sailed 6 days before the Putnam weighed anchor. The crew on the Putnam shouted, swaggered, a good omen that they'd set a record. In February, they stood off Cape Town to fill their water casks and replenish supplies. Then the last familiar landmark faded astern. With luck, their next landfill would be Samarta. Thousands of miles yet to go. The Cape seemed next door to East Indies till a man had sailed the Indian Ocean. 10 days from the Cape, Billy came to Nate with wide eyes. "Mr. Denny's compliments, sir. Could you come on deck?" All well, something's broken loose." Nate checked the glass. It was failing. He went topside. "Mr. Denny said, 'Craziest thing I've ever seen, sir. Hardly enough wind to make sternway, and the waves are pounding us to pieces.'" Nate studied the sky. Huge, cumulus clouds. Another wave crashed on the deck. "A typhoon, Mr. Denny. The waves always outturn the wind. When the wind rises, we'll be able to make headway. We'll carry sail as long as possible. May outrun the storm," Billy whispered. Can we, sir? Typhoons move 100 miles an hour, don't they?" "They just go around that fast," Nate told him. "They don't move across the ocean at anything like that speed. You know how it is when you spin a top? It goes around very fast and gradually moves across the floor." "Aye, sir, I know about a top." "Well, a typhoon, they call it a hurricane in the Caribbean. It's just like a spinning wind top, a huge top. It may be 10 miles across, it may be 20 miles, maybe bigger. The air may be whirling around 100 miles an hour, but the wind top moves across the ocean rather slowly, maybe only 8 or 10 miles an hour, so it is impossible to outrun one." And if we can't, sir, what then?" Billy's eyes were huge in the pale face. "You have to on a port tack below the equator," Nate told him. "I'll tell you all about it sometime if you'd like to know." "Yes, sir. Aye, sir. I'd like that fine." The hours passed. 8 bells. The watch was relieved. 8 bells again, and the starboard watch lay below. The clouds were strange shapes now, and tinged with copper. The wind freshened. "Mr. Danny, have a lifeline rigged," Nate ordered. "Aye, sir." Men stretched a heavy line the length of the Putman from bow to stern. More wind. The top hamper creaked. Lupe grinned and shouted, long as she creaks, she holds, eh?" The rain began, a thin driving mist. 8 bells began again, but no one lay below now. It was all hands on deck. More wind. When Nate finally gave the order to reef sail, the men lay aloft on the double. Huge waves crashed over the Putman. The rain poured until men ducked their heads in a crooked elbow to breathe. 2 men at the helm now. The Putman rolled, scoopers under. Lupe staggered to keep his footing and shouted in Nate's ear, "Got the worst of it now, eh?" Nate didn't try to answer. He knew this was just the beginning. If they were sucked into the center of the whirling windtop, there wasn't a ghost of a chance. At last the wind lessened. The glass began to rise. The huge waves still pounded them. The torrents of water still poured down. But the worst was over. The typhoon was passing them. I was 2 days later before the skies cleared, and Nate couldn't check their position and set his course once more for Samarda. In early May, they sighted the loom of Shadow Mountains off their starboard bow. When they reached the latitude of Susa Bay, they stood off until the sun was behind them. Then Nate sent a man to the foremost to watch for the coral reefs, and a man to the foremost watch for the coral reefs, and 2 men to the chains to sound. Warily they indeed their way through the coral reefs to their anchorage. Other Salem captains were there loading pepper. They were news of home. Nate told them news as of last November and asked about pepper. They shook their heads. Not much chance for another ship to load at Susa. Not for weeks. Nate weighed anchor, beat his way out through the treacherous coral to Pulakoyo. More Salem captains there. They too asked news of home. They too shook their heads over the prospects of another ship loading pepper. Not for many weeks, they said. At last the Putnam anchored at Tule Pass. More men wanting word from home. More men shaking their heads over the prospects of pepper. Maybe when all the ships in port were loaded, maybe he could get pepper. Nate waited. He waited through days and nights of heat that seemed to come from an oven. The decks of the Putman oozed tar. Every day he went ashore to a village. Around him the squat brown men of Samarda spoke politely, and each carried a crease in the folds of his long. The ruler, the dado, and very polite. The captain, he said, were paying $10 for a parcel of pepper. Perhaps if the captain of Putman would pay 11. Nate said he'd wait. More days passed. The heat bore down. The fragrance of frangipani, honeysuckle, and jasmine grew heavy enough to strangle a man. Nate longed for the tang of a sea breeze of North Atlantic. The dado was more polite. Pepper was coming in more and more slowly, he said. He feared the crop was running low. Perhaps if the captain of the Putnam could advance a small sum, say 1,000 or so silver dollars, then the dado could urge his men to greater effort. Nate said he'd wait. The dado sighed and fingered his crease. That night, Nate could not sleep. He went topside to pace the deck. Somewhere he heard a snore. He went forward. Corey, who was on watch, was sleeping. Nate spoke quietly. "Corey, Corey." His voice brought the old Chad running up the hatchway. "What's wrong, Captain? Is he hurt?" Chad's voice cracked. "Is he dead?" Corey started to mumble. "What?" "Aye, aye, sir," Chad roared. "You asleep? On your watch?" The tongue lashing he gave his grandson brought the whole crew topside. "What was it?" they asked. "Had the Malays tried to board?" "If they had," Nate roared, you'd all be dead in your sleep." He turned on his heel and went aft. There was nothing he needed to say to Corey. There was nothing he could say to the heartbroken old man who was Corey's grandfather. More days crawled by. At last the dado said he would have pepper in the Putnam tomorrow. The next morning Nate gave Mr. Denny orders. He was to begin unloading the ballast so he could store pepper. He was not under any condition to let more than 2 Malays on board ship at one time. Nate took Lupe ashore with him. The boat crew landed the scales and the money chest and carried them to the square. The boat returned to the Putman. Lupe and Nate were alone in a swarm of bandy-legged, barrel-chested, powerful brown men. More and more men swarmed into the square with their baskets of pepper to be weighed and stored in bags. Finally, the pepper bags made a wall shoulder high. If the captain would pay now, the Dado said the men would begin taking the pepper to the ship. The price was $12 per pistol. Nate did not hesitate. He slammed down the lid on the money chest. Mr. Sanchez called a boat for us. We'll get pepper somewhere else. Lupe's smile stretched. His eyes were flat black and watchful. He prowled from the square and left Nate alone in the swarm of Malays. 2 minutes passed, 3 and 5. More brown men thronged into a square. A violent argument rose. Nate wished he had had a grammar and a dictionary of their language, too. It might have helped to know what they were saying. At least the Dado approached him, smiling, his hand on his crease. It had been very hard work, he said, but he had persuaded the men to give up their pepper at $11 a pistol. The men were sad. It was choice pepper, the best of the season. That much was true, Nate knew. When the pepper began ripening in January, it ripened on the lower branches first. Not until May were the men harvesting the best of the crop, even $11 a pistol. Nate opened the money chest again. When Lupe returned, the Malays were shouldering the pepper bags and hurrying to the water's edge, loading their pros. Lupe smiled again, and this time he grinned, reached eyes. "Senor," he drawled, "you are quite a guy." Nate and Lupe went to the beach and watched the boats speed toward the Putman. 10 boats, more than 50 men, as they watched a ladder dangle from the Putman. Instantly, a dozen Malays were laying hold, ready to climb. They could hear the angry shouts. Then they saw Denny, Watson, and Jenser appear at the rail with muskets. The Malays edged back. 2 went on board. Nate and Lupe returned to the square to buy more pepper. The next day, the Dado was sad. Why couldn't his men help the Putman? They could save the white men much work at stowing the cargo, Lupe explained. With a mirthless smile as he watching his eyes, he explained. Their captain, he said, was a harsh man. He liked to work his crew hard. Also, he murmured to Nate, "We do our own work, we live longer, eh?" June passed and half of July. More ships anchored at Tully's Pass. One morning when Nate went ashore, the Dado spread his hands and sighed. The 200 pistols he had promised for today, it would be impossible to get. "I wonder," Lupe muttered, "how much you is paying for pepper? Now what? Do we wait him out again?" Nate smiled. "No, we don't wait him out. We sail. We're complete our cargo with coffee at the Isle of Bourbon, or the Isles of France." He told Lupe of the 2 French islands east Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. "I made my first sea voyage in Bourbon," he said. How long ago it seemed. When they reached the Isles of France, 3 ships of Salem and Beverly were there. Polly's father, Captain Ingersoll, was just ready to weigh anchor. He came aboard the Putman to see Nate and get news to take home to Polly. "How was it in Smarta? Any trouble?" "Oh no," Nate told him. "Quite uneventful." Lupe's grin spanned. "Captain Bowditch, he is one guy." Captain Ingersoll cocked his head to one side. "So nothing happened, eh? I see. Well, I'll tell Polly all is well, and to look for you soon after I arrive. It shouldn't take you more than a week to load coffee here." They cheered Captain Ingersoll on his way. Nate said, "Mr. Denny, call the men aft. Soon his men stood facing their captain, a tired crew, haggard with the long months of heat and the grinding toil of the passage to the Isle of France. He knew that every man standing there wanted at least a week on shore before they sailed. He said, "Captain Ingersoll tells me there's plenty of coffee to complete our cargo. Then we've wooded, watered, and provisioned. We'll weigh anchor, and we won't wet that anchor again till Salem Harbor. Do we bear a hand?" They split the air with cheers. In 5 days the putman stood out from the island. When Nate had taken his departure, he did some figuring. It had taken the Henry 11 weeks from Bourbon to Salem. The putman was faster. With luck, they'd be home in early November, maybe even the last of October. They ran into a storm that night. For days they lived in wet clothes and ate cold food. The putman was rowing much too heavily for the cook to make fire in the galley. They doubled the cape and fought headwinds. No speed from the putman now. It seemed to crawl. With a fair wind abaft the beam, the ship could have logged 150 miles in daily sailing. Now she fought headwinds from tack to tack, and some days sailing did not take her 15 miles nearer home. "When the storms are over," Lupe said, we make up for it, eh?" But the storms were never over. For several days at a time, Nate was not able to take a sight. October passed. November came. With luck, Nate told himself now they'd be home by early December. With good luck, he added. In December, they reached the roaring 40s of the North Atlantic and groped their way, close-hauled in the teeth of the gales. At last, the storm subsided. 6 spells of a forenoon watch, Nate said. "Mr. Denny, heave for soundings." Watson carried, the deep sea led forward, and the other men followed, each with fakes of the line coiled in his hand. Collins on the cathead, Sandy in the fore chains, and Jensen in the main chains. Mr. Denny was on quarterdeck with the rest of the line coiled. Denny sang out, "All ready there forward." Watson bellowed, "Aye, aye, sir. Heave! Watch, ho, watch!" It was Collins on the cathead. "Watch, ho, watch!" from Sandy in the fore chains. "Watch, ho, watch!" It was Jensen in the main chains. Mr. Denny sang out, 60 fathoms! They hauled in the lead. Nate checked it. Black mud. They were off Block Island. "Block Island," Lupe grinned. "Next door to home, and the storm is dying." But the storm raged again, as though it had been gathering its strength for one more assault on the putman. Long days passed. The 15th of December, when they sounded, the lead brought up sand. "Off Nacottic," Lupe said. "I dress in my go-ashore clothes." Then the stormy North Atlantic proved that all the other gales had been mere child's play. For 7 days and nights the putman was deluded and hammered. At last the skies cleared. Nate made his observation. "I could have swum from Nantucket that fast," he muttered. Clouds darkened the sky again. For 3 days the rain poured in the waterfall torrents of tropical storms. Only this rain was cold and mixed with sleet, and men struggled with numb fingers to reef and loose sails. In his cabin, Nate rested his head on his hands. He had hoped to be home in early November. With luck, the end of October. Christmas Eve, and they weren't home yet. Something crawled at his attention. He looked around, puzzled, then realized what it was. The wild rolling and pitching of the putman had lessened. At 8 bells, Mr. Denny came into his cabin. "The rain's letting up?" Nate asked. "Aye, aye, sir." Mr. Denny was grim. "This is worse." "Worse?" "Yes, sir, fog." He shook his head slowly from side to side. "I've seen fogs in my day, but this one?" He shrugged, and his shrug was a shiver. "Fog." "Oh boy. Well, Our next chapter will be our last chapter, so we'll see if they make it back home. I hope so. I hope you're enjoying the book. I hope you like, share, and subscribe, and read 30 minutes every day, and enjoy your time. Thank you. God bless you.